Learning triads on the guitar can feel like solving a puzzle with an unknown number of pieces. But of course, there's a finite number of puzzle pieces. So, how can you effectively learn triads when there are well over 144 of them, and not to mention the fact that each triad can be played in multiple positions across the fretboard? How can you manage such an enormous amount of information? Well, you need a system. Because without a system, it can feel like trying to solve a never-ending puzzle. In this video, I show you how I systematize the entire topic of triads in an easy and manageable way. By the end, you'll have a big picture overview of the topic and a clear roadmap for practicing it. Sounds good? Let's dive in. Before we dive into the details, let me first give you a big picture overview of my triad system. First, you need to simplify the guitar fretboard so that you have a limited and manageable area to focus on. And to do this, we divide the fretboard into 4 string sets. The first set includes the E, B and G strings. The second set includes the B, G and D strings. The third set includes the G, D and A strings. The fourth set includes the D, A and low E strings. So, by limiting your attention to just one string set at a time, you now can visualize the triads horizontally across the fretboard. Now, let's get an overview of the theory. The good news, it's relatively simple, because in music theory there are only 2 main triad categories, the major and minor. And each of these has a sibling. The major sibling is the augmented triad and the minor sibling is the diminished triad. So in total there are just 4 triad types: major, minor, augmented and diminished. And since a triad has only 3 notes, there are exactly 3 ways to organize it. In other words, you can play one single triad in 3 different positions: root position, first inversion, second inversion. That's it. In theory, this gives us a total of 12 shapes per string set. If we do the math, 4 strings times 12 shapes, that's a total of 48 shapes. It might sound like a lot at first glance, but in practical reality, it's a little bit less than that. This is because the augmented triad has only 1 shapes for all positions, and the 2 lowest string sets share the same shapes for every triad type. So the real trick lies in understanding how similar each triad is to the other. Once you grasp that each triad type differs by just 1 note, it becomes much easier to remember the shapes and switch between them. So let's take a brief look at the music theory of triads to understand how similar these shapes really are. All triads are built on a straightforward principle. They consist of 3 notes, a root, a third and a fifth, or simply put, 2 thirds stacked together, and there are just 2 main types of triads, the major and minor. A major triad consists of root, major third and perfect fifth. Or you can think of it as a major third stacked on top of a minor third. And a minor triad consists of root, minor third and perfect fifth. Or you can think of it as a minor third stacked on top of a major third. Notice that they differ by just 1 note. A major triad has a major third, while a minor triad has a minor third. Now, let's take a quick look at their siblings. The major sibling is the augmented triad. It consists of a root, a major third and augmented fifth. So it's a fifth increased by a half step. Therefore you can think of it as 2 major thirds stacked together. And notice how the difference between a major triad and an augmented triad is just 1 note. And the minor sibling is the diminished triad. It consists of a root, minor third and diminished fifth. Or 2 minor thirds stacked together. And again, there is just a 1 note difference between the minor and diminished triad. So, for a minor triad, the fifth is perfect, but for a diminished triad, the fifth is diminished. so it's lowered by a half step. If you compare all 4 triads, you'll notice they are only separated by a single note difference. When comparing a major triad to a minor triad, the third changes. Comparing a major triad to an augmented triad, the fifth changes. Finally, comparing a minor triad to a diminished triad, the fifth changes as well. With this understanding, you can clearly see how closely related all 4 triads are. Now, let's take a look at the topic of inversions. The theory of inversions is very simple as well, and you just need to keep a few points in mind. The best way to explain this concept is to show you. So, since a triad consists of only 3 notes, there are exactly 3 ways to organize it. In music theory, we always refer to the lowest note to determine whether a triad is in root position, first inversion, or second inversion. In root position, the lowest note is the root note. That's the definition of root position. In first inversion, you take the root note and move it onto the top, making the third the lowest note. In second inversion, you take the third and move it on the top, making the fifth the lowest note. That's all you need to know about inversions for the purpose of understanding this concept. However, let me briefly emphasize again, the lowest note always defines the inversion, no matter how many notes are being played. So, for example, if you play this C major chord, you're actually playing 6 notes simultaneously. And to determine the inversion, you focus on the lowest note, and in this case, the lowest note is the low E string, which is the third of the chord. And since the third is in the bass, we call this a first inversion, regardless of which or how many notes are above it. I'm just pointing this out to be precise with the music theory. However, for our purposes, we'll only be working with triads of 3 notes, so it's tempting to assume that the first inversion always has the root note on top, but that's not true. Always refer to the lowest note to determine the inversion correctly. Now that you have an overview of my triad system, let's apply this to the guitar. I already mentioned that by dividing the fretboard into 4 sets of strings, you can play triads horizontally across the fretboard. But what about the vertical dimension? Can you play the triads vertically? Well, yeah, don't worry, we'll cover that as well. However, we first need to build a strong foundation. And in order to understand how triads are translated vertically on the fretboard, you first need to master the horizontal dimension. And to do this, everything will become clear when we just play a single triad across the entire fretboard. By doing so, you'll see why it's necessary to learn the horizontal dimension first before attempting to play triads vertically. So first, start by focusing on just one single triad on just one single string set. Begin on the lowest possible position and then move through all the inversions until you reach the end of the fretboard. And due to the fretboard's design, we can't always start in root position. Instead, we need to figure out the lowest possible position for each triad on each string set. Okay. Let's use the C major triad here on the E, B and G strings as an example. The lowest possible triad is the second inversion. From here, the sequence is keep repeating the sequence until you reach the end of the fretboard. Focus on one triad on one string set until you can play it smoothly in both directions. So it should sound fluid like this. Once you feel confident, move on to practicing the same triad on the other string sets. This will take time, obviously, but there are no shortcuts here. So relax and enjoy the process. And to help you out, I've created tabs for all 4 triads in C across all string sets. So if you are unsure where to play them, you can look them up so that you have a good starting point to learn my triad system. So you can use this as a good starting point to go through the C major, the C minor, C diminished and C augmented triads across the entire fretboard using the tabs I created for you. So this should give you a jump start in learning the system. However, if you've completed the exercises from the earlier parts of this series, you shouldn't have too much trouble locating the notes on the fretboard. But if you're struggling here, that's really a sign to revisit the earlier exercises and spend more time there. Because this series was designed so that each part builds on the previous one. By doing the earlier exercises, you'll have the foundational skills to grasp this concept quickly and without too much confusion. Now, let's play the same triad but vertically across the fretboard. But before starting this step, ensure you've practiced the triads horizontally on all 4 string sets. This is essential for mastering the vertical exercise, because if you've practiced the horizontal dimension on all 4 sets, you've already have played vertically because you have practiced each string set. So playing vertically becomes just a matter of connecting the dots, so to speak. So here's the process for how you can practice a single triad vertically. Start on the first string set at the lowest position. From here, play the triad vertically, descending through all string sets. And now ascend back to your starting position. Move horizontally to the next inversion. And now just repeat the vertical descent and ascent. We've worked through this with just one triad, but obviously there are many more to explore. From here, the possibilities for practicing triads are nearly endless, and I recommend creating a practice plan that works for you. You can either focus on practicing the triads you actually need for a specific song or backing track, or if you decide to systematically learn all the triads on the guitar, you can approach with one of the 2 approaches. This approach is very systematic but without musical context. So keep this in mind. Start by playing triads based on the natural notes A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and for each root note go through the 4 triad types. For example, play all A major triads across the fretboard, and then move to all A augmented triads and play them across the fretboard. Then move to A minor and A diminished, and once you've completed all triad types for A, then move to B, then to C, and so on until you've covered all the natural notes. And after finishing the natural notes, expand to the accidentals A sharp, C sharp, D sharp, and so on, and their enharmonic equivalents B flat, D flat, E flat, G flat, and so on. This is really a comprehensive and systematic way to master triads. However, I don't recommend starting with this approach, because it lacks any musical context. It's more about covering all the bases than directly applying triads in a musical setting. But if you like the idea of having a structured system like this, check out the resources on my website where I provide worksheets to help you track your progress with this method. This approach is more practical and musically relevant, especially for beginners. So, start with the triads in the key of C major. Here, you'll practice triads within a single key, so the triads are related and immediately useful for practicing chord progressions or improvisation. So, begin with C major, then move to D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, and B diminished. Practice each triad across the fretboard until you're comfortable with all the triads in the key of C major. And once you've mastered these, you can either move on to a different key or stay in the same key and practice chord progressions like 1-4-5, 2-5-1, 6-4-1-5 or whatever. Or you can practice all the triads in a key by organizing them in the sequence of descending fifths. I've already made a video on this topic, so check it out if you're interested in learning this in detail and getting the tabs. Once you feel confident, start working on triads in other keys. For example, move from C major to G major. Transitioning between neighboring keys is easier because only one note changes and you'll only need to learn 3 new triads for each key. So, you can continue this process through all guitar-relevant keys from F major to E major and focusing on one key at a time. So, with this approach, you won't practice augmented triads initially, and that's okay, because augmented triads are used less frequently compared to major, minor, and diminished triads. Okay, there we have it. Because this 5-part series is so comprehensive, I really feel that a 6th-part is necessary to tie it all together. So, in a future video, I share my recommendations on how to practice everything we've covered here in this 5-part series, and I show you how to create a very structured practice plan that incorporates all 5 parts without too much overwhelm. So, stay tuned and I see you in the next video.